The woman no one claimed. When Ethan Cross stood before the entire town of Redwood Crossing and declared his intention to marry the woman they'd all condemned, the silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was shock. Lydia Hale had spent 4 years as the ghost at the edge of every gathering, the whispered scandal, the cautionary tale mothers told their daughters. She had a son, but no husband, a past, but no future. And she'd learned long ago that some stains don't wash clean, no matter how hard you scrub. But Ethan didn't see a stain. He saw a woman worth claiming in front of God and everyone. And in that moment, everything changed. If you want to see how a town's judgment, a cowboy's courage, and a woman's decision to stop running created a love story that refused to stay silent, then settle in. This is the story of Lydia Hale and Ethan Cross, and how belonging is sometimes built not in secret, but in the bright, unforgiving light of day. Before we begin, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves through Redwood Crossing, Montana territory, as Lydia Hale stood at the edge of the town square, her hands gripping the worn handle of her marketing basket so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The gathering was supposed to be a celebration, the first harvest social of the season, with tables laden with preserves and pies, children darting between clusters of adults, and the general store's porch transformed into a makeshift stage for announcements and music. But Lydia wasn't celebrating. She was calculating the distance to the alley behind the mercantile, measuring her chances of slipping away unnoticed, weighing the likelihood that her 4-year-old son, Thomas, would cry out in protest if she scooped him up and fled before the whispers grew too loud. She'd become an expert at exits. "Mama, look!" Thomas tugged at her skirt, pointing toward a cluster of children playing with a wooden hoop near the church steps. His face was bright with hope, the kind that made Lydia's chest ache with equal parts love and dread. "Not today, sweetheart," she murmured, smoothing his dark hair with one hand. "We need to finish our shopping and get home." "But, Mama, Thomas." Her voice was firmer than she intended, and the light in his eyes dimmed immediately. Guilt twisted through her, sharp and familiar, but she didn't soften. Softening led to staying. Staying led to exposure. Exposure led to exactly what was happening now. "Well, well." The voice came from behind her, syrupy with false sweetness. "Lydia Hale. I'm surprised to see you at a public gathering. I thought you preferred to keep to yourself." Lydia turned slowly, her face carefully blank, and met the cold gaze of Eleanor Pritchard, the banker's wife and the undisputed arbiter of Redwood Crossing's social hierarchies. Eleanor stood flanked by 2 other women, both dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Thursday afternoon, both wearing expressions of barely concealed contempt. "Mrs. Pritchard." Lydia's voice was quiet, neutral. "I was just leaving." "Were you?" Eleanor's eyebrows arched with theatrical surprise. "That's a shame. I was hoping we might have a word about the church charity auction next month. We're looking for donations of preserves and baked goods, and I thought perhaps you might contribute." She paused, her smile sharpening. "Though I suppose some might question whether items from your kitchen would be appropriate for a church function." The words landed like a slap, polite enough in phrasing to maintain plausible deniability, cruel enough in intent to draw blood. The women beside Eleanor tittered softly, their eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Lydia felt Thomas press against her leg, his small body tense with confusion. He was too young to fully understand, but old enough to sense. She forced her shoulders to stay level, her expression to remain calm, even as humiliation burned through her veins. "I understand," she said quietly. "Good day, Mrs. Pritchard." She turned to leave, her hand finding Thomas's shoulder to guide him away. But Eleanor's voice followed them. "It's really quite remarkable, isn't it, ladies? The boldness. To appear in public as if nothing were amiss, as if the whole town doesn't know exactly what she is." Lydia's steps faltered. She should keep walking. She'd perfected the art of swallowing shame and moving forward. But something in Eleanor's tone, the satisfied cruelty, the casual destruction, made her stop. She turned back, and for just a moment she let Eleanor see past the careful blankness to the steel beneath. "What I am, Mrs. Pritchard, is a mother doing her best to raise her son with dignity and kindness. If that offends you, I'm truly sorry. but I won't apologize for existing." The words came out steadier than she felt, and for a heartbeat, Eleanor's mask of superiority cracked, revealing something uglier underneath. But before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Lydia turned to find a man she'd never seen before standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands, his expression polite but his eyes sharp with awareness. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that fell just past his collar. His clothes were clean but worn, working clothes, not town finery, and there was a stillness about him that suggested he didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he continued, his gaze moving from Lydia to Eleanor with deliberate slowness. "But I'm new to town and I'm afraid I'm lost. I was told the land office was near the square, but I can't seem to find it." Eleanor's face rearranged itself into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The land office is 2 blocks east on Cedar Street. You can't miss it." "Much obliged." The man nodded, then turned to Lydia. His eyes were brown, she noticed, the color of creek stones in shadow. "I apologize for the interruption, ma'am. I hope I didn't disturb your conversation." There was something in the way he said it, a subtle emphasis on the word conversation that made it clear he'd heard enough to know exactly what he'd interrupted and that he didn't approve. "Not at all," Lydia managed. "Thank you." He settled his hat back on his head, tipped it politely to all 3 women with equal courtesy, which somehow felt like a quiet rebuke to Eleanor's hierarchies, and walked away. Lydia watched him go, her heart hammering in her chest, unsure whether to be grateful or mortified that a stranger had witnessed her humiliation. "Well," Eleanor said, her voice tight, "I suppose we all have business to attend to." "Good day, Lydia." She swept away with her companions in tow, leaving Lydia standing alone with Thomas in the gradually emptying square. "Mama?" Thomas looked up at her, his small face serious. "Who was that man?" "I don't know, sweetheart." Lydia took his hand and finally began the walk home, her basket still mostly empty, her heart still racing. "Just someone passing through, I imagine." But 3 days later, when she was hanging laundry in the small yard behind the cabin she rented on the edge of town, she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find the same man riding toward her on a sturdy chestnut gelding. She froze, a damp sheet still clutched in her hands, as he dismounted and approached the fence that separated her property from the rutted road. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat. "I apologize for calling unannounced. My name is Ethan Cross. I've recently purchased the old Morrison Ranch about 5 miles west of town. I was hoping I might speak with you for a moment, if you have time." Lydia's mind raced. The Morrison Ranch had been abandoned for 2 years, the house falling into disrepair, the fields gone to seed. She couldn't imagine why its new owner would have any business with her. "Mr. Cross." She set down the sheet carefully, buying herself time to think. "I'm afraid I don't understand. If you're looking for help with the property, I don't—" "No, ma'am, nothing like that." He shifted his weight, and she realized with some surprise that he was nervous. "I wanted to apologize for the other day. In the square, I should have minded my own business, but I heard what that woman said to you, and I—" He paused, choosing his words. "Where I come from, a man doesn't stand by when someone's being treated poorly, but I realize I may have made things worse for you by interfering. If I did, I'm sorry." Lydia stared at him, completely unprepared for this. Strangers didn't apologize to her. They didn't seek her out. They certainly didn't express concern for her welfare. "You didn't make things worse," she said quietly. "Mrs. Pritchard's opinion of me was well established long before you arrived. But thank you for your concern." "May I ask you something, ma'am?" She tensed. "That depends on the question." "How old is your boy?" The question surprised her into honesty. 4? He'll be 5 in January." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the cabin where Thomas was presumably napping. "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Hale, and I'd appreciate it if you'd hear me out before you decide." "It's Miss Hale," she corrected automatically, then immediately regretted it. But he didn't react to the revelation with shock or judgment, just nodded as if she'd told him something he'd already guessed. "Miss Hale," he amended, "I'm starting fresh here. New town, new land, new life. I don't know the history, and I don't know the gossip." What I know is that I saw a woman standing up for herself with grace under circumstances that would have broken most people. And I know I've got a ranch that needs work, a house that needs repairs, and a future that looks pretty lonely from where I'm standing. Lydia's heart began to pound. Mr. Cross, if you're suggesting— I'm suggesting nothing improper, he interrupted gently. I'm saying I'd like permission to call on you, properly, publicly, to bring you firewood when the weather turns, to fix your fence posts, to take you and your boy to church on Sundays if you're willing, to let this town see that you've got someone in your corner who isn't ashamed to stand there. The words struck her like a physical blow. For a long moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was offering and why. You don't know me, she finally managed. You don't know anything about me. Then let me get to know you. His voice was steady, patient. No promises, no obligations. Just a chance. Why? The word came out raw, desperate. Why would you want that? Why would you tie yourself to someone the whole town has already judged? Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. About 6 years back, I made some mistakes. Bad ones. Lost everything. My family's respect, my reputation, nearly my life. I spent a long time crawling out of that hole, and I learned something important along the way. People's judgments say more about them than they do about the person they're judging, and second chances are precious things. Seems to me you could use one. Seems to me I'm in a position to offer it. So here I am. Lydia's eyes burned with unshed tears. The town won't approve. I don't require their approval. He said it simply, as fact rather than defiance. I require yours. So what do you say, Miss Hale? Will you let me try? She should say no. Every instinct screamed at her to protect herself, to avoid hope, because hope led to disappointment, and disappointment led to pain. But standing there in her threadbare yard with her perpetually damp hands and her careful, lonely life, she found herself saying something else entirely. I have a son. I noticed. His father isn't in the picture, won't ever be. I understand. People will talk. Let them. I don't need rescuing, Mr. Cross. I've managed this long on my own. I'm not offering rescue, Miss Hale. I'm offering partnership. There's a difference. She studied him, this stranger who'd appeared in her life like something out of the dime novels she'd once read before survival became her only story. He met her gaze steadily, without pressure, without presumption, just patient waiting. One condition, she said finally. Name it. You meet Thomas first, properly. Before any of this goes further, you meet my son, and if he's uncomfortable with you, the answer is no. Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect. That's more than fair. When would suit you? Tomorrow afternoon, 3 o'clock. I'll make coffee. I'll be here. He touched his hat again, preparing to leave, then paused. Miss Hale? Thank you for giving me a chance. He was mounted and riding away before she could formulate a response, leaving her standing in her yard with wet hands and a hammering heart, wondering if she'd just made the best decision of her life or the worst. Inside the cabin, Thomas stirred from his nap, and Lydia went to him, gathering his warm, sleepy weight into her arms and breathing in the scent of his hair. Mama? He mumbled against her shoulder. Who was that? A man named Mr. Cross, she said softly. He's going to visit us tomorrow. Is he nice? I think so, sweetheart. I think he might be. That night after Thomas was asleep, Lydia sat at her small table and allowed herself to do something she hadn't done in years. She hoped. Eats. The next afternoon arrived with uncomfortable speed. Lydia had cleaned the cabin twice, baked bread she couldn't really afford the flour for, and changed her dress 3 times before settling on the blue calico that was worn but serviceable. Thomas, sensing her nervousness, had been clingy all morning, and now as 3 o'clock approached, he sat at the table drawing pictures with the precious stub of pencil she'd managed to save for special occasions. The knock came exactly on time. Lydia smoothed her skirt, took a breath, and opened the door. Ethan stood on her small porch, hat in hand, holding something wrapped in cloth. Miss Hale, I hope I'm not early. Right on time. She stepped back. Please, come in. He entered carefully, his size making the small cabin feel even smaller, and his eyes went immediately to Thomas, who had stopped drawing and was staring at the stranger with wide-eyed curiosity. "You must be Thomas." Ethan crouched down to the boy's level, a gesture so natural and unthinking that Lydia felt something in her chest crack open. "My name is Ethan. I brought you something if your mama says it's all right." Thomas looked to Lydia, who nodded, and Ethan unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small wooden horse, beautifully carved, with a flowing mane and tail. "I made it myself," Ethan said, offering it to Thomas. "Figured every boy needs a good horse, even if it's only for pretend right now." Thomas took the toy with reverent hands, his face glowing with wonder. "For me?" "For you." "What do you say, Thomas?" Lydia prompted gently. "Thank you, Mr. Ethan." Thomas hugged the horse to his chest, then, in a gesture that made Lydia's throat tighten, he reached out and touched Ethan's hand. "It's the best present ever." Ethan's expression softened in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "I'm glad you like it." He stood, and Lydia gestured to the table. "I made coffee, and bread if you're hungry. I'm always hungry for fresh bread." He smiled, and it transformed his face from merely handsome to genuinely warm. They sat, and for a while the conversation was carefully neutral: the weather, the state of the roads, the progress on his ranch. But Thomas, emboldened by the gift and by Ethan's easy manner, began to pepper him with questions. "Do you have real horses?" "I do, 3 of them. Can I see them sometime?" "If your mama says yes, absolutely." "Do you know how to rope cows?" "I do. Do you want to learn?" "Yes!" Thomas bounced in his chair. "Mama, can Mr. Ethan teach me to rope?" Lydia met Ethan's eyes over her son's head, saw the question there, the deference to her authority. "We'll see, sweetheart. Mr. Ethan has a lot of work to do on his ranch." "I always have time for important things," Ethan said quietly, his gaze still on Lydia. "And making friends with a fine young man like Thomas seems pretty important to me." The afternoon stretched into evening. Ethan stayed for supper, simple stew and bread, but he ate like it was a feast and complimented Lydia's cooking with genuine appreciation. He helped Thomas build a corral for the wooden horse out of twigs and string. He fixed the hinge on Lydia's front door that had been sticking for months. He did all of it with quiet competence, without making a show of it, without expecting praise. And when Thomas finally began to yawn, drooping over his new toy, Ethan rose to leave. "Thank you for the meal," he said at the door, "and for the company. I enjoyed it more than I can say." "Mr. Cross." Lydia stepped out onto the porch with him, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. "Why are you really doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, his face thoughtful in the fading light. "You want the honest answer?" "Please." "Because when I was at my lowest, someone took a chance on me when they didn't have to. An old rancher named Samuel Garrett. He was dying, knew it, didn't care. He gave me work when no one else would, taught me ranching, left me enough money in his will to make a fresh start. He said something to me before he died that I've never forgotten. He said, 'Ethan, being a good man isn't about never falling down. It's about what you do when you get back up and who you help up along the way.'" He paused, his eyes finding hers in the dimness. "You're already back up, Miss Hale. You've been fighting your way upright for years, I'd wager. I'm not here to pick you up. I'm here to stand beside you while you keep standing. That's all. That's everything." Lydia's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. "I don't know if I believe in second chances anymore, Mr. Cross." "Then don't believe in them for yourself yet," he said gently. "Believe in them for Thomas. He deserves to see his mama happy. He deserves to grow up knowing that kindness exists, that not everyone judges, that family can be built, not just born. And you think you can be that for him? For us? I'd like the chance to try." He settled his hat on his head. "No promises, Miss Hale. Just possibility. That enough for now?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then I'll see you Sunday, 10 o'clock. I'll bring the wagon for church. The whole town will see." "I'm counting on it." He smiled, tipped his hat, and walked into the gathering darkness toward his horse. Lydia stood on the porch long after he'd ridden away, her arms wrapped around herself, her heart full of a feeling she'd almost forgotten. hope, fragile and terrifying and impossibly bright. Inside, Thomas called for her, and she went to him, tucking him into bed with his new horse clutched tight. "Mama?" he whispered as she smoothed his hair. "I like Mr. Ethan." "I'm glad, sweetheart." "Is he going to be our friend?" Lydia thought about Ethan's steady eyes, his quiet strength, his willingness to stand in the light when it would be so much easier to walk away. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "I think he is." And for the first time in 4 long years, Lydia Hale let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could be different than the past. Sunday morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of autumn day where frost silvered the grass and breath hung visible in the air. Lydia woke before dawn, her stomach knotted with anxiety she couldn't shake. She'd barely slept, her mind circling endlessly around what would happen when Ethan Cross pulled up to her cabin in broad daylight, in full view of anyone who happened to be watching, and escorted her and Thomas to church like they were a family that belonged. She dressed Thomas in his best clothes, a shirt she'd mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish from the patches, pants that were getting too short, but would have to last another season. She braided her own hair with shaking fingers, pinned it tight, and put on the gray dress she saved for church, the one that was respectable enough to pass without drawing attention. At 9:45, she heard the wagon. Thomas pressed his face to the window, his wooden horse clutched in one hand. "Mama, he's here! Mr. Ethan's here!" Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. She could still change her mind. She could send Thomas out with an excuse, claim illness, postpone this public declaration for another week, another month, forever. But then she thought of Ethan's words on her porch. Believe in them for Thomas. She opened the door. Ethan sat on the wagon seat, reins loose in his hands, wearing what must have been his Sunday best. A dark coat, clean shirt, string tie. He climbed down when he saw her, his movements unhurried, and walked to the porch. "Miss Hale." "Thomas." He nodded to them both. "You look very fine this morning." Thomas beamed. Lydia managed a tight smile. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked quietly, his eyes searching her face. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "That's honest." He offered his hand. "We can turn back any time you say. Just give the word." But she didn't. She took his hand, let him help her into the wagon, watched as he lifted Thomas up beside her with easy strength. Then he was climbing up himself, settling onto the seat, gathering the reins. "Ready?" he asked. No, she thought. But she said, "Yes." The ride into town felt both endless and far too short. Thomas chattered about his wooden horse, about the cows he could see in distant fields, about everything and nothing, blissfully unaware of the significance of what was happening. Ethan answered him patiently, pointed out a hawk circling overhead, asked questions that made Thomas glow with importance. And Lydia sat between them, her hands folded so tightly in her lap her fingers had gone numb, watching the town draw closer with every turn of the wheels. They arrived at the church with 15 minutes to spare before the service began. The yard was already full of wagons, families clustered in small groups, children running between the adults. The moment Ethan's wagon rolled into view, conversations faltered. Lydia felt every eye turn toward them like physical weight. Ethan set the brake, climbed down, and came around to her side of the wagon with his hand extended. She looked at that hand for a long moment, calloused, steady, offering something she wasn't sure she had the courage to accept. Then she took it. He helped her down, the gesture courteous and public and unmistakable. Then he reached for Thomas, swinging the boy down with a grin that made Thomas laugh. And then, with Thomas between them and Lydia's hand resting lightly on Ethan's offered arm, they walked toward the church. The crowd parted like water. Lydia kept her eyes forward, her chin level, her breathing controlled. She could feel the stares, hear the whispers starting up in their wake like wind through dry grass. Beside her, Ethan's pace never faltered, his posture relaxed, as if escorting her to church was the most natural thing in the world. They climbed the church steps. The Reverend stood at the door greeting parishioners, and his eyebrows rose when he saw them, but his training held. "Mr. Cross, Miss Hale, young Thomas, welcome." "Reverend?" Ethan shook his hand firmly. "Fine morning for worship." "Indeed it is." The Reverend's gaze moved between them, questions clearly forming, but Ethan was already guiding them inside. The church was filling rapidly, families claiming their usual pews. Lydia normally sat in the very back, tucked into the corner where she could slip out quickly if Thomas grew restless or if the weight of judgment became too heavy. But Ethan led them halfway up the aisle and gestured to an empty pew. "This all right?" he asked quietly. Lydia nodded, not trusting her voice. They sat, Thomas between them, and Lydia focused on arranging her skirts, on settling Thomas, on anything but the whispers rising around them like a storm gathering strength. She could feel Eleanor Pritchard's gaze boring into the back of her head from 3 rows up, could sense the shock rippling through the congregation. Ethan seemed oblivious to it all. He helped Thomas find the right page in the hymnal when the service began, his voice a steady bass in the singing. When Reverend Mills began his sermon on grace and forgiveness, Ethan listened with genuine attention, occasionally glancing at Thomas to make sure the boy wasn't getting too restless. Lydia barely heard a word. She was too aware of where she was, who she was with, what this meant. By tomorrow, the whole town would know that Ethan Cross had claimed her publicly. And once that door opened, there would be no closing it. The service ended. Families began filing out, and Lydia steeled herself for what came next. The church social was held in the yard every Sunday after service, weather permitting, a chance for the community to gather, for announcements to be made, for connections to be strengthened. Lydia had attended exactly twice in 4 years, both times leaving within minutes when the cold shoulders became too obvious to ignore. But Ethan was already standing, offering his hand to help her up, and there was something in his eyes that gave her strength. "Together," he said quietly. Just that one word. Together. They emerged into the bright autumn sunlight, and Lydia saw the crowd gathered in clusters, saw heads turning, conversations stopping. Eleanor Pritchard stood near the refreshment table with her usual coterie, her expression sharp with disapproval. "Mr. Cross!" A man approached them, barrel-chested and friendly-faced. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. James Wheeler. I run the feed store in town." "Ethan Cross." They shook hands. "I've been meaning to stop by your store. I'll need supplies for the winter." "Any time." Wheeler's gaze moved to Lydia, curious but not unkind. "Miss Hale. Young Thomas. Good to see you." "Mr. Wheeler," Lydia managed. "Mr. Cross here is taking on quite a project with the old Morrison place," Wheeler continued. "Property's been neglected for years. You planning to run cattle or horses?" "Both, eventually, starting with cattle, getting the land back in shape. If you need advice on local suppliers, I'm happy to help." Wheeler smiled. "And welcome to Redwood Crossing. We're glad to have new folks settling in." He nodded pleasantly and moved on, leaving Lydia slightly stunned. It was the first genuinely welcoming interaction she'd had with anyone in town in months. "See?" Ethan murmured. "Not everyone's against you." But before she could respond, Eleanor Pritchard materialized in front of them like a ship cutting through fog. "Mr. Cross." Her smile was brittle. "How kind of you to escort Miss Hale to church, though I confess I'm surprised to see you keeping such company so soon after arriving in our community." "Are you?" Ethan's tone was polite, but something in it made Eleanor's smile falter. "I'm not sure why. Miss Hale and her son are fine people. I consider myself fortunate to know them." "I'm sure you're not aware of the circumstances." Eleanor's voice dropped to a stage whisper that carried perfectly to the families nearby. "Miss Hale has a child but no husband, Mr. Cross. Surely you understand what that implies about her character." The yard had gone very quiet. Lydia felt ice spread through her chest. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading, the public shaming that would send her fleeing Redwood Crossing just like she'd fled every other town before it. But Ethan didn't flinch. "What it implies, Mrs. Pritchard, is that Miss Hale is raising her son alone, which takes considerable strength and courage. What it doesn't imply is anything about her character, since I've found her to be honest, hardworking, and devoted to her child. If you're trying to warn me away from her company, I appreciate the concern, but it's misplaced. I know exactly who I'm standing beside." Eleanor's face flushed. "I'm simply trying to protect you from making a mistake, Mr. Cross. There are plenty of suitable young women in Redwood Crossing who would welcome the attention of a respectable rancher. Women without complications." "I'm not interested in suitable," Ethan said quietly. I'm interested in real. And Miss Hale is the most real person I've met since arriving here. The silence was absolute now. Thomas pressed against Lydia's side, confused by the tension but sensing his mother's distress. Lydia's throat was so tight she couldn't have spoken if she tried. Eleanor drew herself up, her voice turning cold. I see. Well, the community will certainly take note of your choices, Mr. Cross, and I suspect you'll find that choices have consequences in a town like this. I suspect you're right, Ethan agreed, but I also suspect that kindness has consequences too. Seems to me I'd rather face the consequences of treating people with dignity than the consequences of judging them based on gossip. He touched his hat to Eleanor, dismissing her with perfect politeness, then turned to Lydia. Would you and Thomas like to see the ranch? I could use a woman's opinion on what needs doing with the house. Lydia stared at him, her heart in her throat. He was giving her an out, a graceful way to leave this confrontation without fleeing in shame, and he was doing it in front of everyone, making it clear that Eleanor's judgment held no power over him. Her voice came out rough. She cleared her throat, tried again. I'd like that. Thomas, would you like to see Mr. Ethan's ranch? Yes! Thomas's enthusiasm cut through the tension like sunlight through clouds. Can I see the horses, Mr. Ethan? Absolutely. Ethan scooped the boy up, settling him on his shoulders with easy strength that made Thomas shriek with delight. Then he offered his arm to Lydia again. Shall we? They walked back to the wagon through a crowd that had gone from coldly judgmental to confused and uncertain. Lydia heard whispers following them, but they felt different now, questioning rather than condemning, curious rather than cruel. Ethan helped her up, settled Thomas between them, and drove out of the churchyard without looking back. They were a mile down the road before Lydia found her voice. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. She's going to make your life difficult now. Eleanor Pritchard is the most influential woman in town. If she decides to freeze you out, let her try. Ethan's voice was calm. I've been frozen out by experts, Miss Hale. I survived. And I'll tell you something. I'd rather be frozen out for doing right than welcomed in for doing wrong. Lydia looked at him, this man who'd appeared in her life barely a week ago and had already upended everything she thought she knew about people, about kindness, about the possibility of belonging. Why? The word came out broken. Why would you risk your standing in this community for me? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the road ahead. When he spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her. 6 years ago, I was working cattle in Wyoming. Got tangled up with a woman who was married, though she told me she was widowed. When her husband found out, he came after me with a gun. I defended myself. He died. The law called it self-defense, but the town called it murder, and her family called it seduction and sin. Didn't matter that she'd lied to me. Didn't matter that I'd been as much a victim as anyone. I was the outsider, the convenient scapegoat. He paused, his jaw tight with old pain. I lost everything. My job, my reputation, any chance at a future in that territory. I drifted for 2 years, taking whatever work I could find, being run out of towns when the whispers followed me. And then I met Sam Garrett, and he gave me something no one else would, benefit of the doubt. He said, I don't know what you did or didn't do, boy, but I know what I see in front of me, and I see someone who deserves a chance to prove who he really is. Lydia's eyes burned with unshed tears. Sam taught me ranching, taught me that the past doesn't have to define the future, and when he died, he left me enough money to make this fresh start. Ethan finally looked at her, his eyes serious. So when you ask me why I'd risk my standing for you, Miss Hale, the answer is simple. Because someone did it for me, and because I believe you deserve the same chance Sam gave me. To be judged on who you are, not who people assume you to be. I'm not innocent, Lydia whispered. What they think about me, some of it's true. I don't care. You should care. You should know. When you're ready to tell me, I'll listen, Ethan interrupted gently. But it won't change my mind. Whatever happened, whatever choices you made or that were made for you, they're in the past. What matters is now. And now, I see a woman raising her son with love and dignity, despite a town that treats her like she's invisible. That's who you are, Lydia. That's all I need to know. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it made her breath catch. Mama? Thomas looked up at her, his small face worried. Are you crying? No, sweetheart. She wiped her eyes quickly. Just dusty roads. But Ethan knew better. She could see it in the gentle understanding in his eyes, in the way he didn't push, didn't demand, just drove steadily onward. The Morrison Ranch, Ethan's ranch now, appeared over a rise in the road, and despite her churning emotions, Lydia felt a spark of interest. The house was larger than she'd expected, a two-story structure with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides. The paint was peeling and several shutters hung crooked, but the bones of it were solid. It needs work, Ethan said as he pulled the wagon to a stop. A lot of work, but it's structurally sound. Good well, good land. I've been sleeping in the barn while I fix up the house. He helped them down, and Thomas immediately ran toward the barn, shouting about the horses. Ethan smiled. He's got energy, that's for sure. I should stop him. He's fine. The horses are gentle. Let him explore. They walked toward the house together, and Ethan opened the door to reveal a large front room with a stone fireplace, dusty furniture covered in sheets, windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. I know it's rough, Ethan said, watching her face, but I see the potential. Could be a real home, with time and effort. Lydia moved through the room slowly, her practiced eye cataloging what needed doing. The floors needed sanding and refinishing. The walls needed fresh plaster and paint. The furniture would need to be uncovered and assessed. But the space was generous, the light was good, and there was something about it, a feeling of possibility that made her chest ache with longing. The kitchen's through here, Ethan continued, leading her through a doorway. Needs a new stove, but the pump works and the pantry's large. The kitchen was twice the size of her entire cabin. Lydia ran her hand over the worn countertop, imagined what it could be with care and attention. Upstairs there are 4 bedrooms, Ethan said quietly. I was thinking, that is, if things work out the way I hope, one could be for Thomas. Give him space of his own. A boy needs that. Lydia turned to look at him and found him watching her with an expression that made her heart stutter. You're thinking long term, she said softly. I am. Ethan. She struggled for words. I can't. This is too fast. Too much. We barely know each other. I know. He stepped closer, not crowding, but close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. I'm not asking for forever today, Lydia. I'm just asking you to see the possibility, to imagine what could be if you're willing to try. And if I'm not, if I can't give you what you're hoping for, then we'll still be friends. I'll still help with your fence posts and bring firewood. Thomas will still be welcome here to see the horses and learn to rope. Nothing has to change unless you want it to. Why is it so easy for you? The question burst out of her, raw with frustration. How can you be so sure? Because I've lived without hope, Ethan said simply. And I've learned that when something real shows up, you don't waste time questioning it. You reach for it with both hands and you hold on. Outside, Thomas's laughter rang out, bright and carefree. Through the window, Lydia could see him in the corral, reaching through the fence to pet a chestnut mare's nose, his face glowing with joy. He's happy here, Ethan said quietly. He's 4. He's happy anywhere there are horses. Maybe, or maybe he senses the same thing I do, that this could be home. Real home, not just a place to survive until you have to run again. Lydia closed her eyes, overwhelmed. I'm scared. I know, so am I. She opened her eyes, surprised. You're scared? Terrified. He smiled slightly. What if I mess this up? What if I'm not good enough for you, for him? What if the town makes your life so difficult you leave anyway? What if... Stop. She touched his arm, silencing him. You really are scared. Of course I am. This matters. You matter. That's worth being scared over. They stood there in the dusty kitchen, sunlight streaming through the windows, Thomas's laughter floating in from outside, and Lydia felt something inside her begin to shift. Not breaking, but opening, like a door she'd kept locked for years finally creaking ajar. I need time, she said finally. You've got it. And honesty. If we're going to do this, whatever this is, I need complete honesty between us. Agreed. Then you should know... She took a breath, steadied herself. Thomas's father was a merchant who came through the last town I lived in. He was charming, attentive, made promises. I was young and alone and desperate to believe someone could love me. By the time I realized he had a wife and 3 children back east, I was pregnant. He left town before I could tell him. I tried to find him, to let him know, but he'd given me a false name, false references. Everything about him was a lie. Ethan's expression didn't change. He just listened. The town turned on me when my condition became obvious. I lost my job, my room at the boarding house. I gave birth in a charity hospital and left town the day after with a newborn and nothing but the clothes on my back. I've been running ever since, trying to find somewhere that would let me work, let me raise my son in peace. But the judgment always catches up. It always finds us. Not this time, Ethan said quietly. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise I'll stand between you and it every single time. I can promise Thomas will grow up knowing he's wanted, valued, protected. And I can promise that whatever the town thinks, you'll always have a place here. With me, if you want it. Lydia's vision blurred. I don't deserve you. That's not how this works. He reached out, gently wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. We both deserve a chance at happiness. We both deserve to stop running. We both deserve to be seen for who we really are. Don't we? I want to believe that. Then start, right here, right now, just start. Through the window, Thomas called for them, excited about something he discovered. Ethan smiled. Come on, let's go see what your son's found. And Lydia, thank you for trusting me enough to tell me the truth. They went outside together, and Lydia felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, but something close. The fragile, trembling possibility that maybe this time, things could be different. Maybe this time she didn't have to run. Maybe this time she could stay. Thomas had found a nest of barn kittens tucked into a corner of the hayloft, and his delighted squeals echoed through the rafters as Lydia and Ethan climbed up to join him. 3 tiny balls of fur tumbled over each other while their mother, a battle-scarred tabby, watched the humans with wary, yellow eyes. Can we take one home, Mama, please? Thomas's face was luminous with hope. Lydia opened her mouth to say no. They could barely feed themselves, let alone a cat. But Ethan spoke first. Tell you what, Thomas, how about the kittens stay here where their mama can take care of them, but you can come visit them whenever you want? You can help me feed them and make sure they're growing strong. That way you can be friends with all of them instead of just one. Thomas considered this seriously, then nodded. Okay, but I get to name them. Fair deal. Ethan extended his hand and they shook on it, man to boy, and Lydia felt her heart constrict at the sight. They spent the rest of the afternoon at the ranch. Ethan showed Thomas how to curry the horses, how to check their hooves for stones, how to measure out grain for feeding. He was patient and thorough, never condescending, treating Thomas's questions with genuine respect. And when Thomas grew tired, Ethan simply scooped him up and carried him without being asked, settling the boy against his shoulder where Thomas promptly fell asleep. He trusts you, Lydia said quietly as they walked back toward the house. He's a good judge of character. Ethan adjusted his grip on the sleeping child. Better than most adults I know. He hasn't had many men in his life. I worry about what that's doing to him, growing up with just me. You're raising him to be kind and curious and brave. That's not nothing, Lydia, that's everything. She wanted to believe him, wanted to silence the voice in her head that whispered she was failing Thomas every day by keeping him isolated, by dragging him from town to town, by forcing him to bear the weight of her mistakes. They settled Thomas in the wagon for the ride back to town, and the boy didn't even stir. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Lydia, Ethan said as he guided the horses onto the road, what you told me today about Thomas's father, thank you for trusting me with that. But I need you to know something. Whatever happened before, whatever choices you made or mistakes you think you committed, they don't change how I see you. They should. Why? Because you believe someone who lied to you? Because you were young and hopeful and human? He shook his head. The only person who did wrong in that situation was the man who deceived you, not you. The town didn't see it that way. then the town was wrong. He said it with such certainty that Lydia almost believed him. And Redwood Crossing doesn't have to be like that town, or any of the others. We can make it different, together. You keep saying that word, together, like it's simple. Isn't it? You stop running. I keep standing beside you. We face whatever comes as a team instead of as separate people trying to survive alone. Seems pretty simple to me. Nothing about this is simple, Ethan. Maybe not, but it doesn't have to be complicated either. They rode in silence for a while, and Lydia found herself studying him in the fading light. The strong line of his jaw, the capable hands holding the reins, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire. He was a good man. She could feel it in her bones, and that terrified her more than anything else, because good men could still leave. Good intentions could still crumble under the weight of town gossip and social pressure. And if she let herself believe in this, in him, and it fell apart, she wasn't sure she'd survive it. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, glancing at her. "That I'm going to hurt you. Maybe not on purpose, but eventually. I'm going to disappoint you or fail to be what you need, and you're going to regret this." That's a lot of certainty about a future that hasn't happened yet. It's pattern recognition. It's what always happens. Or, Ethan said gently, it's fear trying to protect you by sabotaging something before it can hurt you. I understand that, Lydia. I really do. But you can't live your whole life braced for the worst. Sometimes you have to take the risk. And if I can't? If I'm too damaged to take that risk? Then we go slower. We take it one day at a time, but we don't give up before we even start. He reached over and covered her hand with his, the touch warm and grounding. I'm not going anywhere. The sooner you accept that, the easier this gets. Lydia looked down at their joined hands, calloused and work-worn, both of them carrying the evidence of hard lives and harder choices. And for just a moment, she let herself imagine what it would be like to stop fighting, to stop running, to simply lean into the possibility he was offering. The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating. By the time they reached her cabin, full darkness had fallen. Ethan carried Thomas inside and laid him gently on the bed without waking him. Lydia removed the boy's shoes and covered him with a quilt, then followed Ethan back outside. "Thank you," she said on the porch, "for today, for all of it." "It was my pleasure." He settled his hat on his head, preparing to leave, then paused. "Lydia, there's another church social next Sunday. A harvest celebration, music, dancing, food. Will you come with me? Properly, as my guest?" Her stomach clenched with anxiety. "Ethan, after what happened today with Eleanor, especially after what happened today with Eleanor, let the town see we're not hiding. Let them see I'm serious about courting you." Courting. The word felt strange on her tongue. "Is that what we're doing?" "I'd like it to be, if you're willing." She should say no, should protect herself, protect Thomas, protect even Ethan from the storm that was surely coming. But standing there in the starlight with this man who'd shown her more kindness in 2 weeks than she'd known in years, she found herself nodding. "All right. Yes. I'll come with you." His smile was like sunrise. "Good. I'll pick you up at 5. Wear your dancing shoes." "I don't have dancing shoes." "Then wear whatever makes you feel beautiful, because that's how I see you anyway." He touched his hat, climbed into the wagon, and drove away into the darkness, leaving Lydia standing on her porch with her heart pounding and her mind racing with equal parts terror and something that felt dangerously close to joy. The week that followed passed in a strange blur of normalcy and anticipation. Ethan appeared on Tuesday with a load of firewood and spent 2 hours stacking it neatly beside her cabin, refusing payment but accepting coffee and conversation. He came back on Thursday with a sack of flour and sugar, claiming he'd bought too much and didn't want it to go to waste, a transparent lie that made Lydia's throat tight with gratitude even as she protested. And on Saturday, he arrived with a package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Lydia asked, taking it reluctantly. "Open it." Inside was fabric, beautiful blue cotton printed with tiny white flowers, enough for a dress with material left over. Lydia stared at it, her fingers trembling as they traced the pattern. "Ethan, I can't accept this. It's too much." It's practical. You need a new dress. Consider it payment for all the coffee and conversation you've been providing. His tone was light, but his eyes were serious. Let me do this, Lydia. Let me take care of you just a little. I can take care of myself. I know you can. You've been doing it for years, but you don't have to anymore. That's what I'm trying to tell you. She wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her independence, her pride, her careful walls. But the fabric was soft under her fingers, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd owned anything new, anything beautiful. Thank you, she whispered. You're welcome. Now, I've got to get back to the ranch, but I'll see you tomorrow at 5. He left before she could argue, and Lydia spent the rest of the day cutting and sewing, her fingers flying through work she'd done 1,000 times. By evening, she had the dress assembled, simple but well made, the blue bringing out the color of her eyes in a way her gray church dress never had. Thomas watched her try it on, his face solemn. You look pretty, Mama. Thank you, sweetheart. Are you going to marry Mr. Ethan? The question caught her off guard. Why would you ask that? Because he looks at you the way Papa looked at Mama in the picture book. And he's nice. And he lets me feed the horses. Thomas's logic was childlike but devastatingly accurate. I don't know, Thomas. Maybe. Would you want that? Thomas considered seriously. I think so. Then we could live at the ranch, and I could see the kittens every day, and you wouldn't be sad anymore. I'm not sad. You are, Mama. You're sad a lot. But when Mr. Ethan's here, you smile different. You smile real. Lydia gathered her son into her arms, blinking back tears. When did you get so wise? I'm almost 5, Thomas said seriously. That's practically grown up. Sunday arrived with unseasonable warmth, the last gasp of summer before winter's arrival. Lydia dressed carefully, pinning her hair with extra care, and when Ethan arrived at 5 o'clock precisely, the look on his face when he saw her made the hours of sewing worthwhile. Lydia, his voice was rough. You look beautiful. She felt heat rise to her cheeks. It's just a dress. It's not just anything. He offered his arm. Ready? The harvest social was held in the town square, which had been transformed with lanterns strung between the buildings, tables laden with food, and a small platform where musicians were setting up their instruments. By the time Lydia and Ethan arrived with Thomas, the celebration was in full swing, and once again conversations faltered when they appeared. But this time, Ethan didn't seem to notice or care. He guided them toward the food tables, greeting people by name, introducing Lydia to those he'd met during the week, treating her presence at his side as the most natural thing in the world. James Wheeler approached with a friendly smile. Miss Hale, you look lovely. And young Thomas, my boy Jacob is around here somewhere if you want to play. Thomas looked to Lydia for permission, and she nodded. He scampered off, leaving her alone with Ethan and Wheeler. Mr. Cross, I've been meaning to tell you, Wheeler continued, I spoke with some of the other ranchers about your plans for the Morrison place. There's interest in helping with a barn raising come spring, if you're amenable. That's generous, Ethan said. I'd be grateful for the help. Well, that's how we do things here. Neighbors helping neighbors. Wheeler nodded to them both and moved on, leaving Lydia slightly stunned. See, Ethan murmured, not everyone's against you. Just the ones with the most influence. Influence isn't everything. But even as he said it, Eleanor Pritchard appeared, resplendent in burgundy silk, her expression glacial. Mr. Cross? Miss Hale? How quaint to see you here together again. Mrs. Pritchard. Ethan's tone was scrupulously polite. Lovely evening for a celebration. Indeed, though I confess I'm surprised you continue to flaunt this association so publicly. Surely you must realize how it appears to those of us who care about propriety and morality in our community. It appears, Ethan said calmly, that I'm courting a fine woman with honorable intentions. I'm not sure what's improper about that. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Honorable intentions toward a woman of questionable virtue? Mr. Cross, you're either incredibly naive or willfully blind to the damage this association is doing to your reputation. My reputation is my concern, ma'am, and I'm quite comfortable with the choices I'm making. Are you? Eleanor's smile turned sharp. Because I wonder if you're aware that Miss Hale has been run out of 3 towns in the past 4 years. that she's left a trail of scandal behind her everywhere she's gone, that she's exactly the sort of woman decent people avoid, not embrace. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. The square had gone quiet around them, people pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. Mrs. Pritchard? Ethan's voice had gone very quiet, very dangerous. I'm going to say this once, and I'd appreciate it if you'd listen carefully. Miss Hale's past is her business. My relationship with her is my business. Neither is yours. And if you continue to speak about her in this manner, you and I are going to have a very different kind of conversation. Eleanor drew herself up, outrage written across her features. Are you threatening me? I'm setting a boundary. There's a difference. He turned to Lydia, his expression softening. Would you like to dance? The musicians had started playing, a simple waltz that drifted across the square. Lydia stared at him, her mind blank with shock. Ethan, everyone's watching. Let them watch. He extended his hand. Dance with me, Lydia, right here, right now, in front of the whole town. Show them you're not ashamed. Show them I'm not either. This is madness. Probably, but it's the kind of madness that changes things. His hand remained steady, waiting. Trust me, please. Lydia looked at his hand, then at Eleanor's furious face, then at the crowd gathered around them, watching this drama unfold. She thought about running, about grabbing Thomas and disappearing into the night, about protecting herself the only way she'd ever known how. Then she thought about Thomas saying she smiled different with Ethan, about the fabric he'd bought her because he wanted her to have something beautiful, about the patient way he taught her son to care for horses, about the quiet conviction in his voice when he said she deserved a second chance. She took his hand. Ethan's smile was brilliant. He led her onto the makeshift dance floor, pulled her into his arms, and swept her into the waltz with surprising grace. Around them, other couples hesitated, unsure whether to join or maintain their distance. You're a good dancer, Lydia said, trying to steady her breathing. Sam Garrett's wife taught me, said a man should know how to dance, even if he's just a broken-down cowboy. Ethan spun her gently. You're not bad yourself. My mother taught me, before she died, before everything fell apart. Tell me about her. So Lydia did, letting the words spill out as they danced. Memories of a woman who'd loved books and music, who taught her daughter to sew and read and believe in beauty even when the world was harsh. And Ethan listened, his attention complete, his arms steady around her, as if they weren't dancing in front of a hostile town, but alone in some private sanctuary. Other couples began to join them on the floor, the spell of confrontation breaking into something more normal. But Lydia was barely aware of them. She was focused on Ethan's face, on the warmth of his hand at her waist, on the feeling of being held not with possession, but with care. The song ended. Another began. They kept dancing. Lydia, Ethan said quietly, I need to tell you something. All right. What I said to Eleanor about courting you with honorable intentions, I meant it. I'm not playing at this. I'm not passing time until something better comes along. I'm courting you because I want to marry you, because I want to build a life with you and Thomas, because when I look at my future, I see you in it. Lydia's breath caught. Ethan, we've known each other 2 weeks. I know, and I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm just asking you to know that's where I'm heading. That's the destination I'm working toward. So if you're not interested in that, if you can't see yourself building a life with me, then tell me now, and we can adjust course. And if I say no, then we stay friends. I help with your firewood, and you let Thomas visit the ranch, and we enjoy each other's company without pressure. But I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't be disappointed. Because, Lydia, I haven't felt this hopeful about the future in years. And that hope is because of you. She should be terrified, should push him away, protect her heart, maintain the careful distance she'd cultivated for survival. But dancing in his arms under the lantern light with the music swelling around them, Lydia found she didn't want distance. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted the possibility of home and family and belonging. I can't promise I won't run, she whispered. I can't promise I'm brave enough to see this through. I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for possibility. Can you give me that? She looked up into his eyes, saw the hope and fear there mirroring her own, and made a choice that felt both reckless and inevitable. Yes, I can give you that. His arms tightened around her, and for a moment they just stood there in the middle of the dance floor, holding each other while the music played and the town watched, and something fragile and precious took root between them. Then Eleanor Pritchard's voice cut through the moment like a knife. This is a disgrace, a public spectacle of immorality. Reverend Mills, surely you're not going to allow this to continue. The music stopped. Couples froze. Lydia felt Ethan tense beside her. Reverend Mills stepped forward from where he'd been standing with his wife at the edge of the square. He was a tall man, thin and scholarly, with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness. Mrs. Pritchard, I'm not sure what you expect me to do. I see a man dancing with a woman he's courting. There's nothing improper about that. Courting? He's courting a woman with a bastard child and no husband. He's legitimizing her shame. The word hung in the air like poison. Lydia felt Thomas's presence before she saw him, her son appearing at her side, his small face confused and hurt. Mama? What's a bastard? The question shattered something in Lydia. She dropped to her knees in front of Thomas, gathering him close, her whole body shaking with rage and shame and protective fury. But before she could speak, Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between Eleanor and Thomas with deliberate precision. Mrs. Pritchard, he said, and his voice was cold as winter iron, you just insulted a 4-year-old child in public. You used cruel language designed to hurt an innocent boy who has done nothing to deserve your venom, and you did it because you're angry that I won't accept your judgment of his mother. That's not morality. That's cruelty. And I won't stand for it. How dare you? No, ma'am. How dare you? Ethan's voice rose, carrying across the silent square. You hide behind propriety and religion to justify treating people like they're less than human. You use your position in this community to hurt those who can't fight back. And you call it righteousness. Well, I call it exactly what it is, bullying, and it ends now. He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping across every face. I'm going to say this once, clearly, so there's no misunderstanding. I am courting Lydia Hale. I intend to marry her, with or without this town's approval. She is a good woman, a devoted mother, and she deserves respect. Her son deserves kindness, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Is that clear? The silence was absolute. Then, from the back of the crowd, James Wheeler spoke up. Crystal clear, Ethan. And for what it's worth, my wife and I support you. Lydia's always been nothing but polite to us. We've got no quarrel with her. Nor do we, another voice added. And another, until a chorus of support rose from the crowd. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to tip the balance, to shift the power, to make Eleanor Pritchard's judgment seem petty rather than authoritative. Eleanor's face had gone pale with fury. You'll regret this, she hissed at Ethan. All of you will regret choosing her side over decency. The only thing I regret, Ethan said quietly, is not saying this sooner. Good evening, Mrs. Pritchard. He turned back to Lydia and Thomas, his expression softening instantly. Let's go home. Lydia nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She took Thomas's hand, and together the three of them walked out of the town square through a path that opened before them, leaving behind the whispers and the judgment and Eleanor Pritchard's impotent rage. They rode in silence through the darkness, Thomas pressed between them, his small body tense with confusion. Lydia kept her hand on her son's shoulder, feeling him tremble, and her heart broke into smaller and smaller pieces with each turn of the wagon wheels. Ethan's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the road, and Lydia couldn't tell if he was angry or regretful or already second-guessing the stand he'd taken. She wouldn't blame him. He'd just made himself a pariah in his new town for a woman he barely knew and a child who wasn't his. When they reached her cabin, Ethan helped them down without a word, then followed them inside. Lydia lit the lamp with shaking hands while Thomas stood in the middle of the small room, his wooden horse clutched to his chest, his eyes too wide and too knowing for a child his age. Mama, what did that lady mean? Why was she so angry? Lydia knelt in front of him, forcing herself to meet his gaze even though shame was choking her. Thomas, sweetheart, some people in this world believe they have the right to judge others for mistakes they've made. That lady is one of those people. She was angry because she thinks I made mistakes, and she doesn't think Mr. Ethan should be our friend because of that. But you didn't make mistakes. You're good, Mama. I've made plenty of mistakes, baby. We all have. But that doesn't make us bad people. It makes us human. What's a bastard? The word sounded wrong in his small voice, and Lydia felt Ethan move closer behind her. Thomas, Ethan said gently, crouching down beside Lydia. That's a mean word some people use for children whose parents aren't married. It's supposed to make those children feel ashamed, like they did something wrong just by being born. But the truth is, every child is a gift, every single one, and anyone who says different is the one who should be ashamed, not the child. Is that what I am? Thomas's voice was very small. No, Lydia said fiercely. You are my son. You are loved and wanted and precious. You are Thomas. That's all you need to be. But my papa, your father made choices that hurt us both, Lydia interrupted, her voice breaking. But those were his choices, not yours. You didn't do anything wrong. You're perfect exactly as you are. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then he looked at Ethan with heartbreaking directness. Are you going to leave now because that lady was mean to Mama? Ethan's expression softened completely. No, son. I'm not going anywhere. But everyone was staring, and that lady said bad things. Don't you care what they think? I care more about you and your mama than I care about what narrow-minded people think. Ethan reached out and ruffled Thomas's hair. Besides, a man who stands by his friends when times are good but abandons them when times get hard isn't much of a man at all. And I plan to be the kind of man you can count on. Always. Thomas studied him solemnly, then threw his arms around Ethan's neck in a fierce hug. I'm glad you're our friend, Mr. Ethan. Ethan's arms came around the boy, and Lydia saw him close his eyes, saw something raw and tender cross his face. I'm glad too, Thomas. Now it's late and you've had a big day. How about you get ready for bed? Lydia helped Thomas wash and change, tucked him in with his wooden horse, and sang him the lullaby she'd sung every night of his life. By the time his breathing evened into sleep, her throat was raw and her eyes burned with unshed tears. She found Ethan standing on the porch, his shoulders rigid, staring out into the darkness. Ethan, her voice came out rough. You should go, before this gets worse. He turned to look at her, and she was startled to see fury in his eyes, not at her, but on her behalf. Do you really think I'm going to walk away now, after what just happened? You heard Eleanor. She's going to make your life hell. She'll turn the town against you, ruin your business prospects, make it impossible for you to build a future here, all because you defended me. Good. The single word was hard as iron. Good? Ethan, this isn't a game. This is your life, your reputation. My reputation is mine to spend however I choose, and I choose to spend it on you. He stepped closer, his voice intense. Do you understand what happened tonight, Lydia? We won. Eleanor threw her worst at us in front of the entire town, and we didn't crumble. We stood our ground, and half the town stood with us. Half isn't enough. Half is more than you had yesterday. Half is a foundation we can build on. He took her hands in his. I know you're scared. I know every instinct you have is screaming at you to run before this gets worse. But running won't solve anything. It'll just move the problem to a new town with new faces saying the same cruel things. So what do you suggest? That we just stay? Pretend Eleanor Pritchard isn't going to make our lives miserable? I suggest we stop giving her power over us. I suggest we live our lives openly and honestly and let the town decide who they want to be, the kind of people who judge or the kind who embrace second chances. And if they choose to judge, then we'll know this isn't the right place for us. But at least we'll know we tried. Lydia pulled her hands free, wrapping her arms around herself. You're asking me to be brave. I don't know if I have that in me anymore. You faced down Eleanor twice in public. You've raised Thomas alone for 4 years, keeping him safe and loved despite everything. You work yourself to exhaustion to put food on the table. You protect your son with a fierceness that's beautiful to witness. Ethan's voice gentled. You're already brave, Lydia. You just don't recognize it because you've been told for so long that you're shameful instead. I am shameful. I let myself be seduced by a married man. I brought a child into this world without a father. I've failed Thomas in every way that matters. Stop. Ethan caught her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. You were deceived by a skilled liar. You made the best choices you could with the information you had. And you've given Thomas something more valuable than a traditional family. You've given him unconditional love. That's not failure. That's courage. Tears spilled over, hot on her cheeks. Why are you doing this? Why are you fighting so hard for me? Because I see you, Ethan said simply. Not the version Eleanor Pritchard created in her head, not the scandal or the whispers. I see the woman who mends her son's clothes by candlelight, who walks 3 miles to work because she can't afford a horse, who holds her head high even when people treat her like she's invisible. I see your strength and your kindness and your capacity for love. And Lydia, that woman is worth fighting for. She broke then, the careful control she'd maintained for so long shattering under the weight of his words. Ethan pulled her into his arms and she wept against his chest. For Thomas. For the years of running, for the loss and shame and loneliness that had defined her life for so long. I'm afraid, she whispered when she could speak again. I'm so afraid of hoping for this and having it ripped away. I know. But hope is always a risk. The question is whether the risk is worth taking. He pulled back enough to look at her, his thumbs gentle as they wiped tears from her face. I think you are. I think Thomas is. I think we could build something real and lasting together. But I can't make you believe that. You have to choose it for yourself. Lydia looked up at him, this man who'd walked into her life and upended everything, who'd stood between her and a hostile crowd, who'd defended her son with the ferocity of a father. And she realized with startling clarity that she'd already made her choice. She'd made it the moment she took his hand on the dance floor. Maybe even earlier, the afternoon he'd first appeared at her fence and asked permission to court her. I want to try, she said quietly. I'm terrified, and I don't trust easily, and I'll probably make this harder than it needs to be. But I want to try. With you. Ethan's smile was like sunrise breaking over mountains. That's all I'm asking. He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, a promise rather than a demand. And Lydia let herself lean into it, into him, into the possibility that maybe this time things could be different. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. I should go. Let you get some rest. But Lydia, tomorrow I'm going to call on you properly. And the day after that. And every day after until this whole town knows without question that you're mine and I'm yours. The town already knows after tonight. Then we'll make sure they don't forget. He kissed her once more, quick and fierce, then stepped back. Lock the door behind me. I'll see you tomorrow. She watched him ride away, then went inside and did as he'd asked, checking on Thomas before sinking into her chair by the cold fireplace. She was exhausted, wrung out, but underneath the fatigue was something new, a tiny flame of possibility that refused to be extinguished. The next morning brought consequences faster than Lydia had anticipated. She'd barely finished breakfast when someone knocked on her door. She opened it to find Sarah Wheeler, James's wife, standing on her porch with a basket in her hands and a determined expression on her kind face. Mrs. Wheeler, Lydia said, surprised. Can I help you? Actually, I was hoping to help you. Sarah held out the basket. I brought some preserves and fresh bread, and I wanted to apologize. Apologize? For what? For not speaking up sooner, for letting Eleanor Pritchard make you feel unwelcome in this town. Sarah's eyes were earnest. My husband told me what happened at the social last night, about what Ethan said and what you've been enduring. I'm ashamed it took a public confrontation for me to realize how poorly we've treated you. Lydia took the basket with trembling hands. You don't owe me an apology, Mrs. Wheeler. You've always been polite. Polite isn't the same as kind. Polite is what you do when you want to maintain appearances without actually engaging. Kind is what Ethan Cross did last night, standing up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable. Sarah paused. May I come in? I'd like to talk if you have time. Lydia stepped back, letting her enter. Thomas looked up from where he was playing with his wooden horse, eyes wide. Thomas, this is Mrs. Wheeler. Can you say hello? Hello, Thomas said shyly. Hello, Thomas. My son Jacob talks about you all the time. He says you're very good at climbing trees. Thomas brightened immediately, launching into a detailed description of his tree climbing abilities, and Sarah listened with genuine interest. Lydia made coffee, her mind spinning with confusion and cautious hope. When Thomas went back to his play, Sarah turned to Lydia. I know this must seem strange, me showing up like this, but after last night, my husband and I talked for a long time about how we've allowed fear of Eleanor's disapproval to dictate our behavior, about how we've failed to live up to the values we claim to hold, and we decided that needs to change. Mrs. Wheeler, Sarah, please. Sarah, I appreciate the gesture, but you don't have to do this. I understand how small towns work. Eleanor Pritchard has power here. Aligning yourself with me could cost you. Perhaps, but aligning myself against you is costing me my integrity, and I've decided that's too high a price. Sarah leaned forward. Lydia, my mother was widowed when I was 10. She raised me and my 3 siblings alone, facing judgment every step of the way because people assumed a woman without a man must be desperate or improper. I remember what that felt like, watching her shoulders sag under the weight of their opinions. I swore when I grew up I'd never make another woman feel that way. But I did. I made you feel that way through my silence. And I'm sorry. Lydia's vision blurred. You have no idea what your kindness means. After last night, after years of running, I didn't let myself hope that people could be different. We can be. We should be. Sarah reached across and squeezed Lydia's hand. And I want you to know, you have friends here. Not everyone agrees with Eleanor. Some of us have just been too cowardly to say so. But Ethan's courage last night gave others courage too. You're not alone in this. They talked for over an hour, Sarah asking gentle questions about Lydia's work, her life, her hopes for Thomas. And for the first time in years, Lydia found herself opening up, sharing not just survival details, but actual thoughts and feelings, finding in Sarah the beginning of something she'd almost forgotten existed, friendship. When Sarah finally left with promises to visit again soon, Lydia stood in her doorway feeling like the world had tilted on its axis. Was this real? Could people actually change? Could towns shift? Could hope be something other than a setup for disappointment? She was still processing when Ethan arrived mid-afternoon, his wagon loaded with lumber. What's all this? Lydia asked as he began unloading boards. Your porch is sagging on the left side. Winter's coming, and it'll only get worse. Figured I'd fix it before someone falls through. He grinned at her. Also, I wanted to see you, and I needed an excuse. You don't need an excuse. Good to know. He set down the lumber and pulled her close, kissing her soundly. How are you holding up after last night? Sarah Wheeler came by this morning, brought food and apologies and friendship. Ethan's expression brightened. That's good. That's really good. It is. But Ethan, Eleanor's not going to give up. Sarah said as much. This is just the beginning. Let her try. We'll face whatever comes together. He released her reluctantly and picked up his tools. Now keep Thomas inside while I work. Don't need him getting hit with a hammer or stepping on a nail. He worked through the afternoon, replacing rotten boards and reinforcing the structure with practiced efficiency. Thomas watched from the window, fascinated. And Lydia found herself watching too, memorizing the competent way Ethan moved, the focus in his expression, the simple gift of having someone care enough to fix what was broken. By evening, the porch was solid and safe, and Ethan was washing up at the pump when a rider appeared on the road. Lydia's stomach clenched when she recognized Reverend Mills. Mr. Cross. Miss Hale. The Reverend dismounted, his expression serious. May I speak with you both? Of course. Ethan dried his hands, his body tense. Is there a problem? That depends on your perspective. Reverend Mills removed his hat, turning it in his hands. I've spent the day fielding visits from concerned parishioners. Some are upset about what happened at the social, others are upset about Eleanor's behavior. The community is divided. I'm sorry to hear that, Ethan said carefully, but I won't apologize for defending Lydia and her son. I'm not asking you to. In fact, I came to tell you that my wife and I support your courtship. We believe everyone deserves grace and second chances, and we're troubled by the way Miss Hale has been treated. Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, Reverend. However, Mills continued, I need to be honest with you both. Eleanor Pritchard is calling for a church council meeting to discuss whether Miss Hale should be allowed to continue attending services. She's claiming your presence is a corrupting influence on the children, a mockery of Christian values. That's ridiculous, Ethan snapped. I agree, but Eleanor has influence and she's using it. The meeting is scheduled for Wednesday evening. I wanted you to be aware so you could prepare yourselves, and so you could decide whether you want to attend and speak on your own behalf. Lydia's knees went weak. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading, the inevitable consequence of daring to hope. She'd be driven out of yet another church, another community, another chance at belonging. We'll be there, Ethan said firmly. Ethan, no. Lydia found her voice. This is exactly what I was afraid of. We should just leave, find another town. No. Ethan's voice was steel. We're not running. We're staying and fighting. Reverend, you can tell Eleanor Pritchard that we'll be at that meeting and we'll answer every accusation she wants to level. And when we're done, the church can decide who they want to be, people of grace or people of judgment. Mills nodded slowly. I was hoping you'd say that. For what it's worth, you have my support, and my wife's, and several others on the council. This isn't the foregone conclusion Eleanor thinks it is. After the Reverend left, Lydia turned to Ethan, panic rising in her chest. We can't win this. Eleanor controls too much. She'll twist everything, make me out to be some kind of Jezebel corrupting the town. Then we tell the truth. Ethan gripped her shoulders. We stand up in front of that council, and we tell them exactly what happened to you. We show them who you really are. We give them a chance to choose compassion over condemnation. And if they choose condemnation, then we leave, together. We find a place that deserves us. But Lydia, I think we owe it to ourselves, and to everyone in this town who's been too afraid to stand up to Eleanor, to at least try. She looked into his eyes, saw the conviction there, the unwavering belief that truth and courage could overcome prejudice and fear, and she wanted desperately to believe him. All right, she whispered. We'll try. But Ethan, if this goes badly, if they turn on us, promise me you won't blame yourself. Promise me you'll remember this was my choice too. I promise. Now come here. He pulled her into his arms and she let herself lean against his strength, drawing courage from his certainty. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Ethan helped Lydia craft her testimony, encouraging her to be honest but not self-deprecating, to own her mistakes without apologizing for her existence. Sarah Wheeler visited twice more, bringing other women with her, quiet allies who'd been waiting for someone to give them permission to be kind. But Eleanor wasn't idle either. Lydia heard through Sarah that the banker's wife was making rounds of her own, gathering support, painting Lydia as a threat to the moral fabric of the community, positioning the church council meeting as a battle for the soul of Redwood Crossing. Wednesday evening arrived cold and clear. Lydia, dressed in her gray church dress, braided her hair with shaking fingers and tried not to let Thomas see how terrified she was. Ethan arrived early, steady and calm, and they left Thomas with Sarah Wheeler, who promised to take good care of him regardless of how the evening went. The church was already full when they arrived, every pew packed with curious townspeople. Eleanor sat in the front row, surrounded by her supporters, her expression triumphant. But Lydia also saw Sarah and James Wheeler, saw Reverend Mills and his wife, saw a scattering of other faces that held encouragement rather than condemnation. The church council consisted of 5 members, including Reverend Mills, 3 men and 2 women, all longtime residents of Redwood Crossing. They sat at a table at the front of the church, their expressions carefully neutral. Eleanor stood first, her voice carrying through the hushed space. Thank you all for coming. We're here tonight to discuss a matter of grave importance to our community. Miss Lydia Hale has been attending our church despite living in open sin. She has a child born out of wedlock, and rather than showing proper contrition, she flaunts her situation by courting Mr. Cross publicly. I believe her presence is corrupting our children and mocking the values we claim to uphold. I'm calling on this council to ask her to leave our congregation until such time as she can demonstrate genuine repentance. The words landed like blows, but Lydia forced herself to remain still, to breathe, to wait. Mr. Cross, Reverend Mills said, would you like to respond? Ethan stood, and the room fell silent. I would. But first, I'd like Miss Hale to speak for herself. She's the one being discussed. She deserves to be heard. All eyes turned to Lydia, her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment where she either stood up for herself or let Eleanor's narrative become the only truth the town knew. She rose on shaking legs, gripping the pew in front of her for support, and began to speak. Lydia's voice came out steadier than she felt, filling the silent church with words she'd kept locked inside for years. My name is Lydia Hale. I'm 24 years old. I have a 4-year-old son named Thomas, and Mrs. Pritchard is right about one thing. He was born out of wedlock. She paused, letting the admission settle over the crowd, seeing some faces harden with confirmation of their assumptions while others remained open, waiting. 5 years ago, I was working as a seamstress in a town called Millbrook, 2 territories east of here. I was 19, alone, supporting myself after my mother died of fever the year before. A merchant came through town, well-dressed, well-spoken, charming. He told me his name was William Hartford. He told me he was a widower with business interests back east. He courted me for 3 months, made promises about the future we'd build together, talked about marriage and children and a life of stability. And I believed him. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to continue. By the time I realized I was carrying his child, he'd already left town. I tried to find him, wrote to the business addresses he'd given me, asked around about his family. That's when I learned the truth. His real name was William Ashford. He had a wife and 3 children in Philadelphia. Everything he'd told me was a lie. The addresses were false, the promises were empty, and I was alone and pregnant with no one to turn to. She saw Eleanor's mouth thin with disapproval, but she also saw Sarah Wheeler's eyes fill with tears of sympathy. The town turned on me when my condition became obvious. I lost my job, lost my room at the boarding house. The church refused me aid because they said I'd brought shame on myself through sinful behavior. I gave birth in a charity hospital and left town the next day with Thomas in my arms and everything I owned in a single bag. Lydia's hands trembled as she gripped the pew tighter. Since then, I've lived in 4 different towns. Each time I tried to build a life for my son. I worked honest jobs, laundry, mending, cleaning, anything that would keep us fed and housed. I attended church when they'd let me. I kept to myself, tried not to cause trouble, but eventually someone would learn about Thomas's father, or the lack thereof, and the whispers would start. The cold shoulders, the refused work, the children forbidden to play with Thomas. And each time I'd pack up what little we had and move on, hoping the next place might be different. She looked directly at Eleanor now, her voice gaining strength. Mrs. Pritchard says I'm living in open sin, but I'm not living with anyone. I'm not engaged in any immoral behavior. I'm raising my son the best way I know how, teaching him to be kind and honest and brave. I'm working hard to support us both. And yes, I'm allowing Mr. Cross to court me, because he's the first person in years who's looked at me and seen a human being worthy of respect instead of a scandal to be avoided. Lydia turned to address the council directly. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm not asking you to condone or celebrate the circumstances of Thomas's birth. I'm asking to be treated with basic human dignity. I'm asking for my son to be allowed to grow up without being punished for choices I made before he was even born. And I'm asking this community to decide what kind of town you want to be, one that offers grace and second chances, or one that casts out anyone who doesn't fit a narrow definition of perfection. She sat down, her legs trembling so badly she could barely stand. Ethan's hand found hers immediately, warm and steady. Eleanor rose before anyone else could speak, her face flushed with righteous indignation. A very moving speech, Miss Hale, but it doesn't change the facts. You engaged in relations with a married man. I engaged in relations with a man who lied about being married, Lydia interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. There's a difference between making a mistake and being deceived. You should have been more careful, more discerning. A virtuous woman would have what? Ethan's voice cut through Eleanor's words like a blade. Would have somehow magically known that a skilled con artist was lying? Would have demanded proof of his widowhood before accepting his courtship? Would have been suspicious of kindness and attention because that's what virtuous women do? He stood, and Lydia saw barely controlled fury in every line of his body. Mrs. Pritchard, you're holding Lydia to an impossible standard. You're demanding she take responsibility not just for her own choices, but for someone else's deliberate deception. And you're using that as justification to punish her and her innocent child. That's not righteousness. That's cruelty disguised as morality. How dare you so— No, ma'am. How dare you? Ethan's voice dropped to something quieter, but infinitely more dangerous. You stand there in your fine dress with your respectable marriage and your position in society, and you use that position to kick people when they're down. You judge Lydia for trusting the wrong person, but have you never made a mistake? Have you never been deceived? Have you never needed grace? Eleanor's face had gone pale. My mistakes are not relevant to this discussion. Aren't they? Because I wonder what this town would think if they knew about the money your husband embezzled from the bank 15 years ago, or about how Reverend Mills quietly helped him repay it to avoid prosecution. How you were given a second chance, Eleanor. How this community chose to offer you grace instead of judgment. And yet you deny that same grace to Lydia. The church erupted in shocked whispers. Eleanor stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Reverend Mills raised his hand for silence. Mr. Cross, that's enough. What happened with the Pritchards was handled privately and has no bearing. It has every bearing, Ethan interrupted, because it proves that this community is capable of forgiveness and second chances when it chooses to be. The question is why you'd extend that grace to someone with money and influence, but deny it to a young woman who's already paid a terrible price for trusting the wrong person. He turned to face the packed church, his voice carrying to every corner. I came to Redwood Crossing to start fresh after making my own mistakes. I've been honest about my past because I learned the hard way that secrets poison everything. 6 years ago, I was involved with a woman who lied about being married. Her husband came after me with a gun. I defended myself, and he died. The law called it self-defense, but his family called it murder. I was run out of Wyoming territory with nothing but the clothes on my back and a reputation that followed me everywhere I went. Lydia heard the gasps, felt the tension in the room shift as Ethan's history became public knowledge. For 2 years I drifted. I took whatever work I could find. I was refused service in stores, turned away from boarding houses, treated like I was less than human because of something that wasn't even my fault. And then I met a man named Samuel Garrett, who gave me something no one else would, a chance to prove who I really was. He taught me ranching, gave me work, left me the means to make this fresh start. And before he died, he told me that being a good man means helping others up when they're down, not kicking them while they're there. Ethan's gaze swept the crowd, landing on faces one by one. So I'm standing here tonight asking you to be the kind of community Sam Garrett believed in, the kind that measures people by their character, not their past mistakes, the kind that protects children instead of punishing them for circumstances beyond their control, the kind that offers grace even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. He reached down and pulled Lydia to her feet beside him, his arms strong around her waist. I'm courting Lydia Hale with the intention of marrying her. We'll be building a life together on the Morrison Ranch, my ranch now. Thomas will be my son in every way that matters, and we'll be part of this community if you'll have us. But if you can't accept us, if you'd rather stand with judgment than compassion, then we'll find somewhere else, somewhere that deserves the good people we're trying to be. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Reverend Mills stood, his expression thoughtful. I believe the council needs to deliberate. If everyone could please wait outside while we discuss. The crowd filed out slowly, whispering among themselves. Lydia and Ethan waited on the church steps, neither speaking, both too tense to do anything but hold hands and breathe. Sarah Wheeler appeared beside them, James at her side. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen, she said quietly. Others approached, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. A farmer named Thomas recognized from the feed store, a woman who ran the general store, a school teacher. One by one, they offered words of support, shared their own stories of mistakes and second chances, promised to stand with Lydia and Ethan regardless of what the council decided. Eleanor remained inside the church, isolated now, her supporters noticeably fewer than they'd been when the evening began. 20 minutes passed. 30. Lydia's nerves were stretched so tight she thought she might shatter when the church doors finally opened and Reverend Mills emerged. We've reached a decision, he announced. Will everyone please come back inside? They filed back in, and Lydia felt Ethan's hand tighten on hers as they took their seats. The council members looked serious, but not hostile. Eleanor sat rigid in the front pew, her face unreadable. Reverend Mills stood before the congregation, his voice calm and measured. The council has voted 4-1 that Miss Hale is welcome to continue attending services here at Redwood Crossing Community Church. We find no basis for excluding her based on past circumstances, particularly given that she's shown nothing but integrity and hard work since arriving in our town. Furthermore, we believe that young Thomas deserves to grow up as part of this church family, learning about grace and forgiveness alongside our other children. Lydia felt her knees buckle with relief. Ethan caught her, held her upright. Additionally, Mills continued, the council wishes to make clear that any further harassment or public shaming of Miss Hale or her son will not be tolerated. We're called to love one another, to bear one another's burdens, to offer grace as we've been offered grace. Anyone who cannot abide by those principles may wish to reconsider their membership in this congregation. His gaze landed pointedly on Eleanor, who sat frozen, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Mrs. Pritchard, you cast the dissenting vote. Do you wish to address the congregation? Eleanor stood slowly, and Lydia braced herself for another attack. But when the older woman spoke, her voice was shaking with something that might have been shame. No, Reverend, I have nothing to say. She walked out of the church with her head high, but her shoulders bowed, and this time no one followed her. The congregation broke into relieved conversation, people rising from their seats, approaching Lydia and Ethan with smiles and congratulations. Sarah Wheeler hugged Lydia fiercely, while James shook Ethan's hand with genuine warmth. You did it, Sarah whispered. You actually did it. But Lydia barely heard her. She was looking at Ethan, at the man who'd stood beside her through everything, who'd risked his own reputation and future for her and Thomas, who'd believed in second chances enough to fight for them publicly. Thank you, she said when they finally had a moment alone outside the church, the crowd dispersing into the night. For everything. For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. You did the hard part, Ethan said gently. You told your truth. You stood up for yourself. I just provided backup. You provided everything. She touched his face, memorizing the strong lines, the kind eyes, the certainty that had become her anchor. I don't know how to repay you. Marry me. The words hung in the cool night air between them. Lydia stared at him, her heart stopping, then racing. What? Marry me, Lydia. Not someday, not eventually, soon. Let me be Thomas's father. Let me be your husband. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that love is stronger than judgment, that family is built not just born, that we deserve the happiness we're brave enough to reach for. Ethan, we've only known each other a month. I don't care. I knew the first day I saw you that you were someone worth fighting for. Every day since has only confirmed it. So marry me. Let's stop calling this courtship and start calling it what it really is, the beginning of forever. Lydia looked at him, this impossible man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she'd been too afraid to voice. She thought about Thomas's face when Ethan was around, about the ranch that could be home, about the possibility of belonging somewhere, to someone, completely. She thought about fear and courage, about running and staying, about the difference between surviving and truly living. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Ethan's shout of joy echoed across the empty square as he swept her into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he finally set her down, he kissed her with a thoroughness that made her blush and cling to him for balance. When? He asked against her lips. Soon, before I lose my nerve. 2 weeks. That gives us time to prepare, but not time for you to overthink and talk yourself out of it. 2 weeks, she agreed, then pulled back to look at him seriously. But Ethan, I need you to understand something. Eleanor's not going to disappear. There will still be judgment, still be people who think less of us. This isn't a fairy tale ending where everything suddenly becomes perfect. I know, but we'll face it together. And Lydia, I'd rather face judgment with you beside me than have an easy life alone, every single time. They collected Thomas from Sarah's house, and the boy's sleepy face lit up when they told him the news. We're getting married, sweetheart, Lydia said, kneeling to his level. Mr. Ethan is going to be your papa, and we're going to live at the ranch together. How do you feel about that?" Thomas threw his arms around both of them, his small voice muffled against their shoulders. "I feel happy, Mama. Really, really happy." The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Sarah Wheeler and a growing circle of women who'd been waiting for permission to befriend Lydia descended on the cabin with fabric and thread and enthusiasm, creating a simple but beautiful wedding dress in soft ivory. James Wheeler and other men helped Ethan finish crucial repairs on the ranch house, turning it from a structure into a home. Eleanor Pritchard remained noticeably absent from town events, and rumors suggested she was reconsidering her position in Redwood Crossing entirely. Lydia felt a pang of something that might have been pity. She understood what it felt like to be isolated, judged, found wanting by a community. But she also knew that Eleanor's isolation was self-imposed, a consequence of cruelty rather than circumstance. The wedding was held on a brilliant autumn Saturday, the sky impossibly blue, the air crisp with the promise of coming winter. Lydia stood in the small room behind the church in her new dress, her hair crowned with wildflowers Sarah had helped her weave, and tried to calm her racing heart. "You look beautiful," Sarah said, adjusting the flowers. "Are you ready?" "I'm terrified," Lydia admitted. "What if I'm not good enough for him? What if I fail at being a wife, a partner?" "Lydia!" Sarah gripped her shoulders firmly. "You've already proven you're strong enough to survive anything. Now you just need to be brave enough to be happy. Can you do that?" Lydia took a shaky breath, then nodded. "I can try." The church was full, not packed like the night of the council meeting, but comfortably filled with people who'd chosen to be there, to witness this union, to support this new beginning. Thomas stood at the front beside Ethan, wearing a new shirt Lydia had made him, holding the wooden horse and looking impossibly grown up for a boy not yet 5. Ethan turned as she entered, and the look on his face made every moment of fear, every year of running, every night of doubt worth surviving. He looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked, the home he'd been searching for, the future he'd stopped believing in. She walked toward him through the afternoon light streaming through the windows, past rows of faces that held warmth instead of judgment, support instead of condemnation. And when she reached him, when he took her hands in his and smiled with such open joy that her heart could barely contain it, she realized something profound. She wasn't running anymore. She was choosing. Choosing love over fear. Choosing hope over despair. Choosing to believe that she deserved this happiness, this man, this chance at a life built on truth rather than shame. Reverend Mills's words washed over her, promises and commitments, blessings and benedictions. But what Lydia heard most clearly was Ethan's voice, steady and sure, as he vowed to love her, honor her, stand beside her through whatever came. And her own voice, stronger than she'd expected, promising the same. When Mills pronounced them married and Ethan kissed her, the church erupted in applause and cheers. Thomas tugged at their joined hands, and they scooped him up between them, the three of them standing together in a moment of perfect belonging. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. Food and music in the churchyard, dancing and laughter, toasts from James Wheeler and others who'd become friends through the crucible of the past month. Lydia danced with her new husband, with her son, with Sarah and other women who'd extended hands of friendship when it would have been easier to turn away. As evening fell and the celebration wound down, Ethan loaded their meager possessions into the wagon alongside Thomas, already half asleep, and they began the ride to the ranch, to home. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked as they drove through the twilight. Lydia looked at her sleeping son, at the man beside her who'd fought for her right to be loved, at the land spreading out before them full of possibility and promise. "I'm thinking about beginnings," she said quietly, "about how sometimes the end of running is the start of living, about how family isn't always the one you're born into, but the one you choose and build and fight for." "And," Ethan prompted gently, "and I'm thinking that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Finally." He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "We both are." The ranch appeared over the rise, lamplight glowing in the windows Ethan had left burning for their arrival. Home. Real home, not temporary shelter. a place to plant roots and raise a family and build a future without fear of having to flee in the night. Ethan carried Thomas inside and up to the room he'd prepared, painted blue, furnished with a real bed, stocked with toys and books. The boy barely stirred as his new father tucked him in, placing the wooden horse on the bedside table where Thomas would see it first thing in the morning. Then Ethan took Lydia's hand and led her to their room. Their room, a concept so new and precious she could barely breathe around it. Moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating the simple furnishings, the quilt Sarah had insisted they accept as a wedding gift, the evidence of a life they could build together. "No regrets?" Ethan asked, pulling her into his arms. "Not a single one." She reached up to touch his face, this man who'd given her everything by simply refusing to give up on her. "Thank you for seeing me, for standing beside me, for making me believe I deserved to be loved. Lydia." His voice was rough with emotion. "You always deserved it. I just got lucky enough to be the one who convinced you." He kissed her then, tender and deep, and Lydia let herself fall into it, into him, into the promise of a future built on truth and courage and love that refused to be diminished by judgment or fear. Later, lying in the darkness with Ethan's arms around her and the sound of her son breathing peacefully down the hall, Lydia thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain and shame, the years of running, the belief that she'd never deserve happiness or belonging. And she thought about Eleanor Pritchard's face in the church that night, about cruelty masked as righteousness, about how close she'd come to believing what others said about her worth. But she hadn't believed it. Not in the end. She'd stood up and told her truth. She'd chosen courage over comfort. She'd let herself be loved by a good man and become part of a community willing to choose grace over judgment. She'd stopped running. And in stopping, she'd discovered something she'd lost years ago in that charity hospital with a newborn in her arms and nowhere to go. She'd found herself. The woman she was meant to be, stripped of shame, clothed in dignity, worthy of love simply because she existed. Months passed. Winter came to Montana Territory with snow and wind and cold that tested the strength of both the house and the people within it. But the house held, reinforced by Ethan's skill and care, and the people within it thrived. Thomas grew taller, stronger, more confident. He learned to ride, to rope, to care for the animals with the gentle competence Ethan modeled. He started attending the town school, where he made friends easily, unburdened now by the weight of shame that had followed Lydia for years. The ranch prospered. Ethan proved to be as skilled a rancher as he'd claimed, and their first cattle sale in spring brought enough profit to hire additional help and purchase more stock. Lydia transformed the house room by room, adding curtains and cushions and the small touches that turned structure into sanctuary. She took in sewing work from the women in town, building a small business that let her contribute financially while still being present for Thomas. And slowly, carefully, she began to believe that this wasn't temporary, that she wouldn't wake up one morning to find it all dissolved like morning fog. Eleanor Pritchard did leave Redwood Crossing eventually, moving east to live with a sister, her influence broken by the community's choice to prioritize compassion over condemnation. Some in town missed her organizational skills and social direction, but most, Lydia suspected, felt relief at her absence. Sarah Wheeler became more than a friend. She became family, the sister Lydia had never had. They raised their boys together, shared joys and struggles, created the kind of deep female friendship that sustains through seasons of change. And Ethan proved every day that his promises weren't empty words. He loved Lydia with steady devotion, worked beside her as a true partner, raised Thomas as completely his own. When people in town forgot or didn't know their history, when they assumed Thomas was Ethan's biological son, neither corrected them. Because biology was irrelevant. Ethan was Thomas's father in every way that mattered. On their first anniversary, Lydia stood on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas was in the barn with Ethan, learning to muck stalls, their laughter floating across the yard. The fields were green with spring growth. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. Everything spoke of permanence, of belonging, of home. Ethan emerged from the barn and walked toward her, Thomas riding on his shoulders, both of them grinning. Her family. Her life. Her future. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked as he reached the porch, lowering Thomas to the ground so the boy could run off to play. "About a year ago," Lydia said. "About how I was convinced I'd never deserve this. Never have this. About how wrong I was." "Not wrong." Ethan pulled her close. "Just not ready yet. Sometimes we have to walk through the fire before we can appreciate the warmth of home." "Philosophical tonight, aren't we?" "Must be the anniversary. Makes a man contemplative." He kissed her forehead. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Cross." "Happy anniversary." She leaned into him, watching their son play in the yard of their ranch, listening to the sounds of their life together. "I love you. I don't say it enough, but I do. Completely. I know. And I love you. Not despite your past, not in spite of what you've survived, but because of the woman all of that shaped you into. The strongest, bravest, most loving person I know." They stood together in the fading light, watching Thomas chase fireflies, and Lydia felt something she'd stopped believing in years ago settle deep in her bones. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of certainty. The knowledge that whatever came, they'd face it together. That she had a partner, a home, a community that had chosen to see her humanity rather than her history. She'd been the woman no one claimed, the scandal whispered about in churches and town squares, the cautionary tale mothers told their daughters. She'd run from town to town trying to outpace judgment, believing that shame was her permanent condition. But standing on her porch with her husband's arms around her and her son's laughter in the air and the Montana sky blazing above them, Lydia understood something profound. She hadn't needed rescue. She'd needed recognition. Not someone to save her, but someone to see her. To acknowledge her worth when the world insisted she had none. To stand beside her in the light and refuse to let judgment have the final word. And in finding that, in finding Ethan, in finding courage, in finding herself, she'd discovered what she'd been searching for all along. Not just survival, but life. Not just shelter, but home. Not just existence, but belonging, deep and true and earned through honesty and courage and love. The woman no one claimed had claimed herself. And in doing so, she'd found everything she'd ever needed and more than she'd ever dared to dream.